Hello and welcome to another episode of The Partial Historians. I am one of your fabulous and amazing hosts, Dr. Greenfield.
And I'm rather worse for wear, Dr. Radness.
Your pajamas look stunning.
Why, thank you. Thank you. I aim to please whenever I have house guests.
I love it. The purple.
Yeah, and I've left the fancy earrings on too.
It's very regal, which is interesting given that we're dealing with the end of the regal period.
Or are we?
I don't know. I feel like your pajamas might be signaling warning that we're reaching the end of this.
Yeah, I think we are. I think we are well and truly dealing with the end of the regal period. Finally.
Yeah,
exactly.
We've been looking at the history of Rome from the founding of the city.
Yes.
And we're finally at some sort of critical point in the narrative.
We're about to go from a period where we have virtually nothing but myths into a period where we have basically nothing at all.
Wait for it. You thought the stories were good here. Just wait till we get into the nothing zone of what happens in the next
the dark
centuries.
ages. Yeah.
But before we get into the cloud of obscurity...
That's right, there are one or two important things that we need to clear up. So basically, when we left, Tarquinius was mad, bad, and dangerous to know.
And also exiled from Rome.
Exactly.
Tarquinius Superbus. Oh, you can't be a king while you're in exile.
Yeah, it's actually quite amazing how long he not only rules, but survives in exile, according to our accounts.
Hey, he's the man who refuses to die.
Exactly, yeah. So in my version of things, which is Livy's version of things, basically Tarquinius has just found out that his grand cunning plan has not worked. That the conspiracy's failed, and that now the Senate are so mad at him for his deception that they've said, you know what, forget about your property. We were going to give it back and be nice, but just forget about it.
They basically have a garage sale where all the prices are zero.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Come and take whatever you like.
Come down to Crazy Toga, where all land is gone.
The forum is full of stuff. We need the stuff gone.
Exactly,
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Tarquinius Superbus, apparently not very happy. Not only is he in exile, but now he's lost all of his stuff to the plebs.
Now, you see, if I were him, I must admit, I think I'd feel like giving up.
Look, I'd always have a backup plan.
Yeah. His backup plan is interesting and unexpected in my eyes.
Really?
Yeah, kind of.
Prepare to be surprised, listeners. Prepare to be surprised.
Yeah, so basically he decides, okay, well, tricky's not going to work. Better call on war. And he goes around the cities of Etruria, particularly the people of Veii.
Interesting choice.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. G, but haven't we talked about war between these people in Rome before?
Quite substantially.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly, yeah. And also the Tarquinensians. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly.
But that makes more sense, because at least they're from the family ancestry.
Totally, yeah, that's the whole thing, I get that. But yeah, they. And yeah, basically, he goes, says, look at what they've done to me. Oh my God. Like, I'm in exile and I'm poor. It's just the worst thing that you could possibly do. And Tarquinensis, I'm like your blood, man.
Maybe you guys, we could get together and we could take Rome down.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you see, if I were the people of Veii, I'd say, get lost.
I don't know if you've noticed, but we hate you.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that is not the way that they behave.
No, they actually seem to feel sorry for him, according to Livy. And they're like, yeah, you know what? We're going to finally right all those wrongs. We're going to join you and seek revenge on Rome. Yeah.
I'm not sure what to make of this, besides feeling like the sources at this point in time are entirely fabricated.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, again, Tarquinenses say, well, yes, you do share our name and our blood, and it seems like a fine thing for one of us to be king of Rome, so yes, we shall join you. That seems to make sense
That
to
does
me.
make sense to me.
Yeah.
But I'm not surprised that the people of Veii never become more substantial than this tiny blip in the history of Italy, because frankly, they don't know how to play their politics.
They're a doormat. If I was on 30 Rock right now, I'd be saying, deal breaker.
It's just It's just so... Oh,
Yeah.
I mean,
What were they
where is
thinking?
the strength of character?
I know.
Anyway.
So anyway, Tarquinius basically sets off and says, "Ahoy, I've got 2 armies behind me." And I love how the translation of Livy puts this. "To regain his kingdom and to chastise the Romans." Naughty Romans.
Don't you think you can get away with exiling this young fella?
Get that purple out of storage.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so, so Tarquinius gets some forces together, and he seems to be planning this while his ambassadors are still in Rome, trying to negotiate on his behalf, and the conspiracy thing is going down.
Yeah,
very
tricky.
Yeah, the Romans hear about it, and they're like, oh, and now the warfare is coming. I see.
We should have known.
And they mobilise.
Yeah.
Rightly so. And they set themselves up near the Tyrrhenians, which is where the Tarquinenses originate from.
Right, yeah.
And the first engagement between the forces reveals that actually, despite the sort of recruiting that Superbus has gone about and done, the forces are about the same size.
That's convenient.
Yeah, and it's the classic sort of test and feel, who's got what numbers, and everybody retires and there's really no outcome, and everyone's like, oh, all right.
Yeah, except in my version of things, basically you've got one of the consuls, Valerius, who you may recall from our previous episode. He's basically in charge of the foot soldiers in that part of the army. Brutus is in charge of the cavalry, and he basically goes ahead to sort of scout things out. And basically, while he's out, having a little bit of a scoot about there, he happens to see his enemy, the son of the king. This one is Aaron's, just in case you've been following the Tarquin sons with avid interest. We have mentioned him before. Yeah.
Look, Sextus is around somewhere, but it's Aaron's that Brutus runs into while he's sort of gallivanting.
And even though Livy has all these, fine sayings, I basically see it as this sort of a thing. It's you! It's you! Yeah!
This is interesting because this actually deviates relatively substantially from Dionysius's account.
Really? Because basically they just charged each other with absolute hatred and loathing. And basically, and Livy's little aside, which I can't help but feel is some sort of commentary on someone he's talking about in the present day. He says, in those days, it was to a general's credit to take part in the actual fighting.
Oh, snap.
Yeah. Augustus may bring whatever.
We'll get to those implications in many centuries' time.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so basically, they charge hatred, loathing, bitter animosity, and basically, they're so furious with each other, they kind of seem to impale each other a little bit, and they fall dying from their horses. Such is the glorious end of
Sounds
Brutus.
Euphemistic when you put it like that.
Well, there's a fine line between hatred and...
Each stabbed the other. Both were wounded.
Yeah, so where does that come in your narrative?
Well, we have the first engagement, according to Dionysius, of which the armies are just sort of test a feel and be like, yes, we're all soldiers. Yeah. Retire for the evening.
We're much equal.
Second engagement.
Yes.
Valerius is in command of the right wing, so he's opposite the population, the soldiers that come from Veii. And
easy pickings, I would say. Easy pickings. Yeah, exactly.
And the left of the forces are taken by Brutus. Right. And he's opposite the Tarquinii, who are under the command of the sons of Superbus. Of course. So both Sextus and Aaron's are there. Right. Anyway, Aaron's, they're lined up for battle. Aaron's is like a little bit, cocky. He rides up towards the Romans, close enough so that they all recognise who he is.
Right, yeah.
Hello. Royal family, that's right.
Yeah, Brutus, yeah. Look at this, look at the splendour, look at the splendour, yeah.
See my regal aspect.
Exactly.
But just out of range enough that nobody can do anything to him.
Exactly, yeah.
And he basically starts abusing Brutus. And I took the quote directly from the translation because I kind of loved it. Yeah. Called Brutus a wild beast. One stained with the blood of his sons. Ooh. And reproaching him for cowardice and cravenness. And finally challenging him to decide the general quarrel between them by fighting him in single combat. So he's like, how about it? You're a coward. I think you've got the blood of your sons on your hands.
Yeah. That would be really harsh, because this would only have really just happened.
You're completely uncivilized.
Yeah.
How about you take me down like a man and come over here?
I was actually imagining something which I thought was quite harsh, but it's nothing compared to that. I was going to say, like, hey, Brutus, remember the days when you were stupid and we used to make fun of you?
No.
I forgot about the fact that you could mock him with his son's death. Duh.
Doesn't decide to go down that path. Decides to hit him where it really hurts.
Yeah.
Brutus is unable to resist this type of abuse.
Of course he is.
Classic soldier mistake. You're with your armed forces, don't get split up.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
If you have an army, you may as well use it.
You're being taunted, just wait till everybody's on board and then charge together.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you could wipe the smile off his face pretty quickly if you decided not to have single combat and
maybe
just
kill him with your excessive numbers because he's outside of the comfort zone of his own forces at this point in time. No. Brutus is incensed by this and charges at Aaron and is like, I'll take you up on that.
Yeah.
They clash. They fatally wound each other.
Right.
Dionysius does go into a whole bunch of description about this, one of them in the thigh, you know, here. In any case, both of them are fatally wounded.
Yeah.
They fall off their horses, they're lying on the ground.
Much like a movie, yeah.
And everybody's like, on both sides is like, we need to fight now. And they, and like everybody goes crazy and it's like a bloodbath. Anyway.
Yeah.
Battle ensues.
Okay, yes. Well, see, mine is so much less illustrious than that, really, because not only does Brutus get killed off, like, immediately in the first day of battle, but basically Livy kind of says, well, they were kind of equal, and, you know, there's people from they were used to being beaten.
Ouch!
They were quickly dispatched. It's only really the other guys that put up any sort of fight, the Tarquinians. And basically, it was kind of even Stevens at the end of the day. And yet, in spite of this, for some reason, during the night, they just panic.
No, I've got some good info on this.
Okay.
Yeah,
right. Okay.
Trust our Greek source material here.
Do you have a prodigy? Because I'm kind of feeling
I'm feeling it.
Good.
I've highlighted it in my special religious colour.
Yeah, well, Livy does go into that, but, so yeah. Anyway,
well, we have this moment where... the battle does appear to be relatively even.
Right.
Valerius's forces are victorious over the soldiers from Veii. Not a problem. Chases them to their camp.
Yeah.
Litters the ground with bodies, apparently, as you do.
Of course.
The Tyrrhenians, so those under the command of Titus and Sextus Tarquinius, so the other two sons, aside from Aaron's, who's now dead.
Yeah, finally.
They force the Romans to flee in the end.
Right.
They pursue the Romans to their camp.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the Roman camp is... chock full of veterans, the Triarii, which is Roman tradition to do so. The battle at the camp is not a pushover for the Tarquinii. What with their veterans there defending it. Yeah. And so they retreat for the night.
Cool.
So each army retires at the end of the day.
Yeah.
The Romans are trying to decide what to do next. Yeah. And then they hear a voice in the grove. And they speculate that it's either the fabled hero... Horatius, or possibly the god Faunus. Nobody's quite sure.
Yeah, see, in Livy, it's the voice of Silvanus. There's no option.
Well, Silvanus would be more equivalent to Faunus.
Yeah.
Than the fabled hero.
Yeah.
Horatius. In any case, the voice commands the Romans to sort of retain their courage, and says that the enemies, their death count actually exceeds the Romans by 1. So, the idea...
Wow.
Yeah. So, the whole premise of this story is that the armies are equal in size, and that equalness is actually not an approximation, but turns out to be an exact thing.
That's pretty close.
Because it turns out that one more of the enemy is dead than the Romans, and this needs to be capitalised upon.
Yeah, I have to admit, Livy is not that specific.
This inspires Valerius.
Yeah.
He attacks the Tyrrhenians' entrenchments in the night and takes their camp.
Okay,
done and done.
Yeah, basically what happens is there's this prodigy, they hear the voice that tells them, "We will conquer more."
What does the voice say?
Yeah.
Say it again, fabled Silvanus.
And basically then they wake up and, you know, everyone's fled in a panic and they're like, woo!
Sweet.
Yeah, exactly, no more fighting. And that's when Publius Valerius gathers together all the spoils, of course, and returns in triumph and gives Brutus a magnificent funeral.
Oh, yes.
That's pretty much, it's pretty much how it ends, rather unspectacularly.
Yeah, and so we've actually lost Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who expels the kings of Rome.
And how.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And despite the fact, dear listeners, that Tarquinius Superbus is not dead yet, I think this is an opportune moment to sort of take a step back and maybe do a bit of a recap of what the Regal period is, what really has gone on, what sense can we make of any of these narratives that we've come across.
I can answer you in one sentence, Dr. G. Flint and none.
God damn it.
Yeah. No, to be fair, there are lots of theories about what exactly is going on in this period. I mean, I think one of the most intriguing situations I've heard suggested is that because so many of the people who are involved in the immediate aftermath of Superbus's exile are somehow connected to the Tarquin family, that there are these rumours of a palace coup.
Oh,
and that perhaps the whole thing with Brutus's sons and whatever, that's just a continuation of that, juggling of power. And basically, Superbus and his sons are gone, but some of the family still remain, and they're left behind sort of trying to, fight for power, basically fight for dominance. And that's what's really happening at this time.
What, the expulsion of the kings is just a convenient political mechanism for
basically
part of the family to get rid of the other part of the family?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, it's being suggested.
No.
The problem is, and this is the thing that we always have to come back to with this period, there's zero evidence for that. It's basically all of us just going, okay, let's fill in the gaps here. We've got all these people who are somehow connected. What is going on?
Yeah, I mean, Brutus is related to the Tarquinii. We can't get around that. So what is his motivating purpose for really getting rid of Superbus?
Yeah.
I mean, he's got a real grudge to bear. His father his elder brother have been killed by Superbus.
Exactly, so is it just family factions?
To carry a chip on your shoulder.
Yeah, well.
But he sort of makes a rod for his own back, because if he's interested in getting rid of them, but actually not necessarily eliminating the idea of kingship, it doesn't really go that way.
Well, yeah, and see, this is the other thing. It's very hard to really put things in a chronology that makes sense for this period, because we've talked about, the consulship. But it seems that we can't even say for certain that when this whole dynamic, I suppose, came about, that they were actually even called consuls. It seems that maybe they were called praetors from the beginning, which ends up becoming sort of this, one of the steps under consuls, further down the line in the Republic.
Yeah.
And in fact, they might have even this office called Praetor Maximus. Now, did that actually mean anything? Did that mean that there was one, praetor/consul that was slightly superior to the other? What is going on here?
Ooh.
Yeah, and is there actually some sort of slower transition in which you go from kings to having some sort of maybe sole magistrate, and that's who the Praetor Maximus was, and then you get the consulship? What's happening?
This is interesting, because this plays a little bit into the narrative of Servius Tullius, who is the king prior to Tarquinius Superbus.
Yeah.
And the sorts of ideas that surround him is that he seems, some of the narratives are disputed. So he gets identified as perhaps a usurper himself, who may have killed his predecessor. So we have Tarquinius Priscus, who has that moment where he's axed in the head.
Yeah, that was a memorable moment.
Axed in the head.
While he's trying to help these shepherds.
While he's trying to help out these disputing shepherds.
Yeah. And Servius Tullius is the guy who he basically raised as a son.
And Servius Tullius has this mythical, obscure background.
Yes.
So created from scratch, as you were. And he comes into this position of power because Priscus's wife argues in his favour.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not an inter-ex situation, really.
No, and Roman women aren't known for playing this kind of role in politics.
Well, and if
not that she's Roman, but nonetheless.
Well, and if women are playing this sort of role, it's interesting that it sort of lasts out in the narrative as well.
Yeah.
It's an odd thing to have there, because it's not how the Romans like to do business.
No, it is not.
They do not like their women involved in public life.
No, they do not.
And if anything, this could be taken as a sign that Servius Tullius is playing a really interesting and awkward political game. So, he may have killed his predecessor.
He was the one with the axe. Put in the head.
He may have put the axe metaphorically into the hands of those shepherds rather than others. So he himself is seen as a breaker of tradition, if you like. So despite the huge arguments that are going on in our sources from Brutus about how much Superbus is breaking with tradition and coming into power in a way that stands outside of custom. He's not the only one who has those sorts of issues with his narrative.
No, and I mean, another thing that I've come across is last episode you talked about the Rex Sacrorum. I think I said that correctly.
The Rex Sacrorum.
Yeah, the Rex Sacrorum, which was basically this office to take care of the sort of religious ritual functions associated with the king, so that even though the monarchy might be over, these rites are still being taken care of.
Yeah, these rites and sacrifices need to remain.
Yeah. And again, it's been suggested that perhaps what actually happened was that this office sort of took, was part of this gradual transition from monarchy to republic. So basically, you have this situation where kings might have been stripped of their actual political power, but they had this sort of figurehead left in place for some time. So kind of like what we have, I suppose, with Queen Elizabeth II right now, where she's just a figurehead. She doesn't really have much political clout or involvement, Well, I shouldn't say she doesn't have political clout. She doesn't have. She doesn't
really get actively involved.
Government. I don't think so. But yeah, exactly. They're not actively involved, and that perhaps this is where that idea sort of comes from, maybe. But again, where is the evidence for this?
Yeah, it's hard to know where the divisions really lie.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, you do also have this. Rome, as you shall see, most memorably in a couple hundred years. Rome does also have this office of dictator.
Yes.
Yeah, someone who's supposed to come into sole power in times of emergency, preferably only for 6 months,
Help, it's emergency.
Yeah, exactly. Is this something that dates back to this period? Like another sort of sole power type thing?
It feels like my feeling is like probably no.
Yeah.
Because you've got this situation where the kings basically are doing that anyway, so you don't really need a role for that.
Yeah, true.
And going from my pragmatic perspective, where things are only really created when a need is revealed that something isn't working properly.
Yeah, that's what the dictator is.
Yeah, it's when the consulship starts to break down as a mechanism for taking care of an emergency that it makes sense to be like, maybe we should have a limited time offer on a sole person in charge.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And basically, you'll find that even though I think it is fairly well accepted, because the sources are more or less in agreement that this change happened before 500 BC, you will actually find people who will argue that this whole shift actually took place, as late as sort of 450.
Yeah, well, our sources are writing much later, far later, than the time period they're talking about. And even when we start to get the fragmentary source material that forms the basis of what they're using, that doesn't even come into play until like the 4th and 3rd centuries. Yeah. So we're about to enter into our really like fragmented dark zone of materials. Should be good for narrative. And it's hard to know exactly how much access the historians that we do have had to those sources.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. They're certainly, as you guys have seen, they do indicate, from time to time, like with Brutus' sons. That whole conspiracy there, that seems like a kind of a big deal to me. And yet the only names that they have for certain are these people that are involved with Brutus' family. It'd be really interesting to know who the other people were who were involved.
And there presumably are others. I guess the thing to take away from this is that Romans are going through a process of defining their own identity through writing history.
Yeah.
Whether that be through somebody like Livy, who is clearly Roman, or somebody like Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who takes an interest in Roman history and wants to relay it to the Greeks.
Yeah.
They're filtering their ideas through the way in which Romans want to read their own past.
Yeah, and
And they want to have clear lines. Yeah. They want to make it really clear that there's a reason why they don't have kings.
Yes.
And they've got to establish a narrative for that.
Oh boy, is there. I mean, let's face it, by the time Livy's writing, I mean, this is post-Caesar's, little spree with dictatorship and stabby incidents.
Yeah, there is a real need to reinforce why these things shouldn't happen.
Yeah, and it seems kind of odd that it's under... someone who's arguably the first emperor, or princeps, if we want to be technical, of Rome.
I want to be technical.
Yeah, that Livy's writing under Augustus, the successor of Julius Caesar, the man who sort of brings back, the sole male rule thing.
Yeah, we can't divorce these sources from their own context in which they're writing. And they're writing in the last century of the Republic and the transition into the Principate. And that makes it very hard to be able to assess the worth of any of the stories that they're telling us, because they're very much coloured, one, by their own ideas about what this history means, and for the Romans in the time that they're writing.
Yes.
But also there's, the cultural aspect as well. Dionysius of Halicarnassus really paints Superbus as a Greek tyrant.
Yes, yeah.
And the whole framing device in the way that characters are represented plays nicely into the philosophies of the time period as well.
Yeah.
Dionysius is not the only one making an argument for the value of expediency versus the value of what is just. These are the sort of concepts that are coming into play in Cicero's writings as well.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of discussions going on about what are the right sorts of behaviours. How can we establish the grounds for behaviour?
And you've got to think it's also kind of explaining how their world is the way it is. You know? I mean, as we've looked at... and
when you don't have the internet.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Or many... books and stuff. Yeah,
books and stuff.
Just you just got scrolls and it's just annoying.
Or you talk to people who know stories that people told them, but people who also told stories.
Exactly, yeah. When that's what you have access to, I mean, what they've done is actually, I think, amazing. I mean, I struggle and I have access to the internet and, international shipping of any books that I want. And, it's amazing what we have access to. So we can't judge them too harshly. But, you have to sort of look back and say, okay, so is that actually how long so-and-so held power for? Or is that just a way of explaining how long the consuls hold power for? Or, whatever. You have to sort of say, this is a way of sort of explaining the world around them. And also explaining, Livy's writing at a pretty high point in Rome's career. Is this a way of explaining or, telling people how Rome came to be such a power,
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a self-confirming narrative. Yes. How did Rome come to be the power that it is?
Yes. I believe, and therefore I am.
Yeah, they had lots of wars, and over and over again, apparently.
Because, Rome, Rome is still, even though, yes, we're at the birth of the Republic or whatever, Rome is still nowhere near the predominant power.
No. Yeah. And I think that's what's interesting about these narratives as well, is they actually acknowledge that quite well.
Yeah. But considering how much arse they seem to kick, particularly in Livy's version of things, you would kind of feel like they've made some headway. And sometimes I wonder, how much headway have they actually made?
No.
Is it more just that they've managed to, keep the wolf from the door and keep their own...
And it's also a handbook for what not to do when you're in power as well. A lot of this is covert advice, you would imagine.
Yeah. Moral messages, people, moral messages.
Please read this and don't be a tyrant.
Yeah.
Have you considered?
No rapey and no purgy of the Senate.
Maybe don't slaughter your own sons.
Yeah. And use slaves for your building constructions, goddammit.
Don't race good Roman citizens on building works.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so I guess I hope that helps maybe sum up a little bit the fact that we don't really know anything.
As much detail as we've provided you since the founding of the city.
Yeah.
Actually, we know very little at all.
Yeah. I guess for me, Dr. G, I'm going to sum up my key message here.
Oh, please do.
Yeah, okay. I think the thing to take away from these histories, apart from the great stories and the myths and that sort of thing, is that you have to think of these sorts of histories, I think, as revealing almost more about the period that they're written in than the period they're writing about.
Well, yes. I will agree with that to a certain extent. I mean, the Romans do obviously have a history.
Yeah.
How much of that history is what's in our sources, I think is totally up for dispute.
Yeah.
And we get to the point where some of these figures, like Ancus Marcus and things like this, when just nobody even is sure that they actually lived.
Yeah. But they're still important, though. They still...
Oh, yeah. And the idea that you might have somebody... be a king and to dedicate buildings and to have that physical evidence present, and that being not enough to establish your historicity as a person is incredible. And yet that's the sort of thing that we face with this regal period in Rome's history, and partly to do with the survival of records. The continuation of the writing isn't there, so we don't have, from our perspective, the preservation of evidence is such that we just don't have that certainty.
Yeah, and one of the accounts that I've read by a modern historian, I think, has a good message to sort of take away, in that, okay, yes, there are all these possibilities, which are plausible given the evidence that we have, but essentially it still all comes down to just guesswork. And the fact is that...
This is why I love history.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact is that, you know, sitting where we are right now, what right do we have to be super critical and judgmental about these sources? Because presumably, okay, yeah, they might be writing a couple of 100 years after the event, and yes, the stories might sound quite mythical, but surely they know more about it than we do.
Well, perhaps. I mean, part of this is to do with the way that we frame how we think about history.
Yeah.
And what is it. And history operates, by and large, from the idea that on some level, there is an objective, actual past that happened.
Unless you're a postmodernist.
Well...
in which case there's nothing.
Danger.
Just historians.
Danger.
Yeah.
I flirted with postmodernism, and it really doesn't help with history.
No.
Or at least not the sort of history that we do.
No.
But there is, like, some sort of finite, actual reality that occurred. There is a real past.
Yes.
And the
that
question...
hopefully is reachable.
Yeah, and then the question becomes, well, how can we judge the accuracy of the representations of that past?
Yeah.
So we're always holding the sources up to a standard which we really actually can't get to.
No, especially since considering that, you know, particularly Rome itself, it's still a living, breathing city, you know, and how can we possibly, you know, if we want to marry up the historical records with the archaeological records, it's very tricky.
It is.
You know?
And when it comes down to it, even if there is, let's say, an objective actual past that did occur, any person's perspective on that past is going to be different anyway.
True. No one eats a piece of cake the same way.
Wise words, Dr. Agnes Wise. I bow before you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. You and Dad. Stun you with my brilliance.
Yeah. I feel like that sums it up nicely. And before you have your cake and eat it too, perhaps we'll end right there.
Fair enough.
And come back next time to consider what's going on in the post, or the very sort of last sputterings of what might be a regal period.
We've saved some good myths for next time, in case you were wondering.
Indeed.
And if you enjoyed this episode, we would really appreciate it if you shared our page on Facebook, tweeted us on Twitter, or wrote a review on iTunes.
Oh, yes. We're in so many places these days.
We are.
So modern.
Bye.
Farewell.